Mr. Rude by Roger Hargreaves. Hello boys and girls, Auntie Katie is going to read Mr. Rude by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfy? Mr. Rude by Roger Hargreaves. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Mr. Rude is rude. He is very rude. He is very, very rude. He is worse than very, very rude. He is extraordinarily rude. What a rude man. When you meet someone, you might think to yourself that the person has a large nose. But you wouldn't say anything to them, would you? Because that would be rude, wouldn't it? Well, Mr. Rude would just blurt it out. Big nose. But he wouldn't stop there. Oh no, not Mr. Rude. Big nose. With a nose like that, you could vacuum the floor. Can you imagine saying that to someone? Well, I hope you can't. It's a rude thing to say. And he was the same with everyone. If he met someone overweight, he would shout, "Fatty, you're supposed to take the food out of the fridge, not eat the fridge as well." How rude. When he was driving along in his car, he would yell rude things at the people he passed by. Mr. Rude was a horrible man who didn't have a nice thing to say to anyone, and not surprisingly, no one liked him. There he is, being rude to everyone that he's driving past. One day, Mr. Rude met little Miss Tiny, or not so much met as nearly trod on her. "Good morning," said little Miss Tiny. "Look at the size of you," exclaimed Mr. Rude. "Squirt, you're so tiny I could squish you under my thumb." Poor little Miss Tiny burst into tears and ran home. There she is, running home. Behind a tree on the other side of the lane, Mr. Happy looked anything but happy. He had heard everything. The next morning, Mr. Happy was outside Mr. Rude's house, suitcase in hand. Mr. Happy knocked on Mr. Rude's front door. "Go away," shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy knocked again. Mr. Rude opened the door. "Can't you read?" said Mr. Rude, pointing to his doormat. Mr. Rude's doormat did not say welcome like everyone else's doormat. Mr. Rude had crossed out welcome and then, in large black letters, had written "Go away" underneath. There's his mat. He's crossed out the welcome and he's written "Go away" in the big black writing. How rude. Mr. Happy smiled, barged past Mr. Rude and went into the living room. "Get out!" shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy smiled an even larger smile and sat down in the armchair. There he is, sitting in Mr. Rude's house. Mr. Rude exploded. He ranted and raged for half an hour, but Mr. Happy calmly sat through it all smiling. Eventually, Mr. Rude went into the kitchen to make himself supper without offering any to Mr. Happy. How rude. After his supper, Mr. Rude ranted and raged for a full hour, but whatever Mr. Rude called him, Mr. Happy took no notice. Finally, Mr. Rude turned out the lights and went upstairs without offering Mr. Happy a bed for the night. There's Mr. Happy. There's Mr. Rude yelling at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy's just smiling away, taking it all in. When he came down in the morning, Mr. Happy was still there, still smiling. "Okay, I give in," cried Mr. Rude. "What do you want?" "Breakfast would be nice," said Mr. Happy. "Please." Mr. Rude made breakfast for him. There he is, making breakfast for him. Mr. Happy still smiling away in the armchair. It was the first time in Mr. Rude's life that he had ever done anything for someone else. In fact, it was the first time he ever asked anyone what they wanted. "Thank you," said Mr. Happy when he had finished. "Right, you can go now," demanded Mr. Rude. But Mr. Happy did not budge. Mr. Rude ranted and raged and raged and ranted, but he ended up making lunch for Mr. Happy and supper. There's Mr. Rude coming along with Mr. Happy's supper. He even offered Mr. Happy a bed for the night. There's Mr. Happy, still smiling in bed. Mr. Happy stayed for a fortnight. Slowly the ranting and raging became less and less. Mr. Rude discovered that he had something that he had never known he possessed. I wonder what that was. Manners. There's Mr. Rude, and he's developed his manners. Isn't that lovely? So nice to have manners. When it was time for Mr. Happy to leave, he shook Mr. Rude's hand and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Rude. I really enjoyed my stay." Mr. Rude beamed a smile that was every bit as wide as Mr. Happy's and found himself saying, "And so did I." Mr. Rude was a changed man. Look at Mr. Happy smiling, and now Mr. Rude smiling. Burp, belched Mr. Rude. Well, almost. Mr. Rude by Roger Hargreaves.